Hi friends, how are you all doing? Today I want to share with you my favorite books from 2018, and if you're just here for the books, you can skip forward to where I start talking about the books. But first I have a few other things that I want to say. First off, thank you so much to A Book Olive for the shout out again, and to the over 200 of you that have since subscribed. The increase of traffic to my channel has been really exciting and very intimidating as well. I'm excited that there are more people watching and really hope that this leads to more conversations in the comments and things like that, so feel very welcome to comment and share with me your thoughts on what I'm reading and recommendations and what you're reading. And yeah, next I first off want to address those of you that might be wondering, why is this girl talking about her favorite books from 2018? It's the middle of February, like that's so a month and a half ago. Yeah, if you're new to this channel, then you especially might not know, but I was very sick at the beginning of the year, so I missed out on all the fun talking about my favorite books from 2018. I didn't want to miss out on the conversation, so I'm just throwing a party for myself, for posterity's sake, right? For context, I read 64 books this year. I had 14 books that I gave 5 stars to. Of those 14, I have 8 that I want to share with you my thoughts on, and about 6 that I want to share just like one sentence about how I liked them. I'll consider them honorable mentions because if they got 5 stars, I feel like they should be mentioned. Like that's really great. For the record, I think that giving 5 stars to 25% of the books I read is kind of high, but I'm also proud of myself for having that much of a gauge of what I'm really going to enjoy in a book. So I'm pleased with that, and I do stand by this list. Like, I really thought all these books were amazing. So let's get started with the honorable mentions. The first one is A Visit to William Blake's Inn in Poems for Innocent and Experienced Travelers by Nancy Willard. This is a short picture, like children's picture book of poems. This one sort of took me by surprise. I didn't expect to love it so much. It was beautiful. I love the artwork. It was just a delightful, beautiful set of poems. Loved it. The next one I read was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. It was very interesting to see and hear the perspective from a child who was born as a mixed race and grew up during the apartheid. Additionally, it was very funny because Trevor Noah is very funny. The next is The Complete Persepolis by Marjane. Strapi. This is a autobiographical graphic novel of the author's childhood growing up during the Islamic Revolution in Pakistan. I thought it was fascinating. I loved what I actually learned about the Islamic Revolution during this book, which I'm shameful to admit was more than I should have learned. It had deep messages while also being really, really accessible. Cried the Beloved Country by Alan Paton is the next one. This is a great work of South African literature. I listened to it and I loved the themes. I loved the dialogue and prose that were beautiful and impactful. It was really an elegant book. I loved it. Animal Farm by George Orwell. I love political and social commentary, and I found this book really enjoyable and thought-provoking in a lot of ways. It's a classic, everyone's heard of it. It's a great book. Next I read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. I picked this up thinking I was just reading a children's book and I wanted to know why it was considered such a classic, and instead realized that there were so many levels and themes and that this was a beautifully intelligent and thought-provoking book. I would really like to reread this book because I found it very interesting and like I didn't actually comprehend everything it was about. Moving on to my top 8 books of the year. They are in sort of a rough ascending order of favoritism, but these first 4 are all evenly ranked. I couldn't really put one above the other in terms of favoritism, but we'll start with Vincent and Theo, the Van Gogh Brothers by Deborah Heiligman. This is a YA novel about the lives of Vincent and Theo, or Theo, which would be more correct, but I don't speak Dutch, so it's a narrative based on the letters exchanged between these two brothers. It's a beautiful book that emphasizes the relationship between these two men, between these brothers. Really, it has such a high rating because it evoked a lot of emotion from me. I remember crying a lot and just finding it a very tender and evocative book. I have a degree in art history, and though I do not specialize in Van Gogh or in the Impressionist time period, I'm familiar enough to know that this is not meticulously accurate to the facts. The author is definitely being selective and using events and letters and facts selectively and in the way that supports her narrative. So the downside is that it's not a nuanced perspective of Van Gogh's life, but it is a beautiful capsulization of the two brothers' relationship. And I really love that, because sometimes with Van Gogh we emphasize or sort of get fixated on the fact that he had a lot of mental illness, when the reality is that he sought to medicate himself and his art was his medication, and that we romanticize his art because of his mental illness, but we would never have his art at all if it weren't for the nurturing brother. He actually created all that work because he was able to cope, because he had a loving brother. So I loved that it emphasized this relationship. We would never have Vincent van Gogh if it weren't for his brother Theo. The next book on my list is Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. This is the sequel, kind of, but not really, to Kill a Mockingbird. This book was technically written before To Kill a Mockingbird, but the events of it happen later, when the main character, Jean Louise, is a bit older and returns back to her town and finds that she doesn't necessarily agree with the thoughts and mentality that most of the citizens of the town espouse to. It's not a flawless book, and there's a lot of nuance and diverging opinions. What I enjoyed about this book was that the main character is forced to confront the fact that she has grown up and away from the mentality that she was raised with, that her heroes that she grew up with don't really reconcile with her perspective of the world anymore, and that her home is a place she doesn't quite recognize or identify with. I thought it was a really beautiful book. If you have strong emotional attachment to Kill a Mockingbird and the characters there, I can see why this would be disturbing and frustrating, and I of course don't agree with all of the opinions. The narrative that it sort of upheaves, and the ways that it contradicts To Kill a Mockingbird, but if you follow just Jean Louise's arc in this book and her experience, I related to them. I felt like it was really insightful, and it was just a very interesting new perspective on To Kill a Mockingbird. Mostly it's this high up on the list because I was really captivated in the reading experience of this book, and it was very thought-provoking and stuck with me for a long time after reading it. The next book I want to share with you is called A Man Called Ove by Frederick Backman. This is a book about a grumpy old man who is very logical and no nonsense, and in his elderly years in life he doesn't find that he's getting as much out of life as he would like to, and he lives in a community of people who seem to be annoyingly insistent upon being his friend and pushing their ways into his life. And it's hard for me to explain exactly what the book is about, because that's not the point. What makes this book great is not so much the narrative as it is all of these characters that are well-rounded and nuanced and fleshed out. They are fleshy characters that you come to care about so much. There are themes and messages in this book that are heartwarming and wonderful, so subtle, but just absolutely on the nose at the same time. At the moment, I'm reading my second book by Frederick Backman, and I find his writing masterful, really. It's quite fantastic, and he's becoming one of my new favorite authors. The next one I want to share with you is called Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson. This book is about a main character named Jade, who is an African American who lives on the poor side of, I think it's Seattle, or maybe it's Portland. but is very smart and has a scholarship to a very rich and white school on the rich side of town. The crux of this story is really about the main character, Jade, exploring and discovering her own identity in juxtaposition to her community and art and the people and places that affect her and influence her life, all while she finds her own voice. It was a beautiful story where the author really guides and provokes crucial conversations about some issues that we maybe don't approach with as much nuance as they deserve, and I thought it was beautiful. It was very insightful. The role that art plays in this book was also really beautiful to me, as the main character does collages. She enjoys art. It serves a great function in sort of a parallel narrative and metaphorical term. I quite liked it. I thought it was a beautiful book. I would really recommend it. The next book on my list is Into That Darkness, An Examination of Consciousness by Gita Sereny. This is a fascinating book, and first off, I didn't expect it to be this high on the list. It's really here because I found it so intellectually captivating. It really was one that stuck in my thoughts for many weeks. This is a nonfiction about the interviews that Gita Sereny, the main character, has with a man named Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka, an extermination camp during World War II. This book and the interviews that Gita Sereny has with Franz Stangl are not trying to hear his explanation for why he did what he did. Instead, she's trying to take the most objective and unemotional approach into examining the psychology of this man and understanding, how the psychology of this man's experience could bring him to being able to tolerate or justify his actions. It was fascinating to me to read these interviews, hearing this man talk about his life in ways that made it very clear that he had a capacity to deeply love and to empathize or to be merciful. And yet he's very selective about what he feels guilt or takes responsibility for in a way that doesn't seem quite logical, and yet is clearly very ingrained in him. It was an interesting read, definitely very disturbing at times, and the objective nature of it makes it not as emotionally wrecking to read, but it's certainly still a very shocking and overwhelming subject matter. I personally found it quite fascinating. If this is the kind of book that sounds like it would be interesting to you, you'd probably love it. It was a very interesting read, and I was captivated the entire time reading it, and it was stuck in my thoughts for months afterwards. So we're down to the last three, and the next two are really sort of tied in the same position. My last one is definitely my favorite book, but these next two, I don't have a strong preference for which one I love more, but we'll start with Peter Pan by Jm Barrie. Peter Pan is a story that I think most people are familiar with, and I was as well, and so the story itself is not exactly what captivated me in reading this book. Instead, it was feeling that I was reading a work of art, that I was reading a master at their craft, that I was being able to just experience this work of art. There are so many levels of symbolism and things like that in this book, and even though I was not trying to dive in and understand all of those things, just a surface level reading of the book definitely left me feeling like I was just skimming the top level of what the author was doing here, and that is a fantastic feeling. I love feeling like there is more for me to dig into in a book. The imagery was delicious, and the nonsensicalness of so much of the book was just really, really fun. It's also a very short book at I don't know, maybe 100 pages. I would say it's definitely worth the time to read. The next book is West with the Night by Beryl Markham. This is a memoir about the author's life, naturally, who grew up in Kenya and was a horse breeder and then a pilot, and was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic from east to west. What I loved about this book was that it was beautiful. The writing in this book was just breathtaking. It was so, so beautiful. Ernest Hemingway actually praised Beryl Markham's writing in this book, saying that something along the lines of that she can write circles around all of us and puts me to shame as an author. And truly, this was probably the most beautifully written book that I read this entire year. She writes about her experience living in Africa and flying over the desolate wilderness of Africa. There are just so many interesting stories about her life, as I think the book was written in 1912 and she was a female pilot, you know, before the book was written, so the very early 1900s. And it was really fascinating. All of the stories were fascinating, and it was just gorgeously written. I actually listened to this book on audiobook while driving through Namibia. So part of my experience was just like looking at these vast, gorgeous deserts and sand dunes while listening to this beautiful book. It was a very delightful experience. I'm glad that I can associate this book with that experience, but you of course don't need to be in the Namib desert to appreciate this book. It will transport you there by itself. It is just gorgeous. It was a beautifully written book. Absolutely recommend it. And the last book, my favorite book of the entire year, it was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor, Towles. I actually made an entire review on this book, and I'm actually really proud of that review. I think I share a lot of what I loved about this book in that review quite well. If you want to hear more about it, then watch that review. But essentially, this is about a man who was put under house arrest in Moscow, and it is a intergenerational story about the 40 years that he lives in the hotel. It is gorgeously written. I love, love, love the writing. I love the characters. All of these characters are well fleshed out and gritty, fleshy characters that I was so invested in. I loved the intelligence of this book. There were so many prose and thoughtful monologues that just I thought were beautiful. I loved the scenery and the sensual texture that the entire hotel gave, the opulence of this grand golden era of Russia hotel that was slowly seeping into a communist era. There was so much texture and atmosphere in this book that just made you feel like you were there. When I finished this book, it was the only book of 2018 that legitimately gave me a book hangover. I didn't want to move on to other books. I wanted to just go back and curl up and live inside this book because it felt so captivating. I really enjoyed it, obviously, and would totally recommend this book. It's especially a fantastic winter read. I would very much recommend reading it during the winter. So slip it on your TBR right now or next fall. It was a great book and I would highly recommend it. So there are my favorite books of 2018 plus 6 honorable mentions just for good measure. I'm really pleased with my reading year and that I had so many 5-star ratings. If you have any thoughts on those books or if you've read them, I'd love to hear that down below. If you want to share with me your favorite books from 2018, even though it's the middle of February, I would love to hear them as well. Thank you for watching and I'll see you guys in a future video. Bye!